Our reading today is from Mark chapter 12, verses 38 through 44. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and to have the best seats in the synagogue and places of honor at the banquet. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor woman came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything she had, all she had to live on."
You might be thinking, golly, Jesse, you're up there really early. What happened to our Laughing Bird psalm? Well, we have a very special Moments for Mission today, and so I've been kind of shaving off little things here and there in the service to make way for our presentation for Moments for Mission. But as far as this morning goes, we're on week 6 of our studies in the book of Mark. Mark, if you don't know, is my favorite gospel because it is so straightforward. It's the oldest of the 4 gospels in the New Testament, and a lot of scholars feel that this makes it the gospel that's closest to the source material, both written and oral tradition. So I like it because it focuses on what it means to follow Jesus, which I believe is the church's highest priority. So I got to tell you, before we go any further, I've got to tell you about the type of songs that we do at Community of the Great Commission. We have camp songs, and some of them are called Nito Repeato songs. Like, what did you say? Nito Repeato songs. Yes, you heard me right. They're sort of a call and response song where the leader starts out with the phrase, "This is a Nito Repeato." And then, the people who are singing repeats what that leader says. So here's a demonstration. "This is a Nito Repeato." Good job. So say what I say and do what I do. Again, this is a Nito Repeato song. So let's take a look at what Mark has. Mark, if you want to kind of get him down to the most basic things, Mark is a Nito Repeato guy because he says what the Christian faith is all about, what following Jesus is all about is doing, saying what Jesus says and doing what Jesus does. Sounds simple, right? Except when Jesus says or does something that we don't agree with. And that's why it's important for the church to remind people to say what Jesus says and do what Jesus does. So our focus in Mark's gospel this morning, or at least for the last 6 weeks, has been on what Jesus has to say about the kingdom of God. Now, we've discovered that Jesus' idea of the kingdom of God rarely has anything to do with the kingdoms of earth. In fact, they are downright antithetical to them. They're completely upside down. And this kingdom isn't out there somewhere in some faraway heavenly realms. It's on its way. In fact, Jesus says it's here. It is close at hand. When his disciples asked Jesus how they should pray, he said, "Say this, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So the idea of a kingdom that reflects God's values rather than humanity's values was important to Jesus. He used the phrase kingdom of God 80 times in the Gospels. And he wasn't shy about pointing out that earth's kingdoms are lacking in the moral integrity and that only God's kingdom represents God's values. However, the people who benefited most from earthly kingdoms disagreed with him. So who disagreed with him? Well, among them were the Pharisees. They were the leaders of the dominant expression of the Jewish faith at that time. They didn't appreciate what Jesus had to say about God's kingdom because it challenged the level of power and prestige that they had been gaining by being in cahoots with the Herodians. And the Herodians were the puppet government that was set up by the Romans to keep the Jewish people in line during that time. Okay, then there were the Sadducees. The Sadducees had a problem with Jesus too, except for their problem was more theological than anything else. Then there were the scribes. The scribes, as we learned last week, were the educational elite of the Jewish tradition, and they just wanted to make Jesus look foolish with their trick questions about the knowledge of the law. So most of the time, the gospel writers use the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians as kind of the foils to highlight what Jesus said about the kingdom of God. You might be thinking, well, thank you for all this Bible nerd trivia, Jesse, but what's your point this morning? Oh, you wait. I'm nowhere near done with the Bible nerd trivia here. This week's lesson has to do with an unusual act of generosity. It's not that generosity itself is unusual in the New Testament. In fact, there's plenty of examples of generosity in the Scriptures. So here's your first Bible nerd trivia question for the morning. What do the widow at the temple that Georgia just read about have in common with the wise men who brought gifts to the Christ child, the little boy whose 5 loaves and 2 fish fed a crowd of 5,000, and the woman who used a jar of expensive ointment to anoint Jesus' feet? What do you think are the common ground for all of those? Faith. Sacrifice. There we go. That's getting there. Pardon? No, name. Really? Oh my gosh. You're right. They're about generosity, but what are their names? Well, can anybody name these people? No. Pardon? The wise men have names, really? I'll tell you what they are because I read that somewhere. Let me tell you what they are. Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar. Okay, now, if you can tell me where that reference is in the New Testament, I will treat you to dinner at any restaurant you want here in town. But she's not going to be able to because it's not mentioned anywhere in the Bible. In fact, those 3 names, you know when they came up? The 8th century. 800 years after Jesus was around. And the assumption, get that, first of all, the assumption was that there were 3 wise men. New Testament doesn't say a thing about how many wise men there were. Bible says nothing about that. They were legends. By the 8th century, these were legends. Think of it like biblical fan fiction, okay? Christians were probably so frustrated that they didn't know the names and details about some of these important characters that they came up with names and backstories for them. Again, biblical fan fiction. So imagine sitting around discussing Bible stories and then saying, what do you suppose the name of that kid was who had that picnic lunch that fed 5,000? I don't know, Chuck, Timmy? You know, the woman who anointed Jesus' feet, Barbara, Dixie, the woman who dropped the copper coins in the temple, Sandy, Charlotte, I don't know. We don't know. But why do we not know the names of these important characters? Because when Tom preached a couple of weeks ago about the blind beggar that Jesus made to have his sight again, his name was Bartimaeus, or Bart, if you just want to call it for short. So what about these other people? The wise men, the 5 loaves and 2 fish kid, the woman who anointed Jesus' feet, and this widow at the temple all gave sacrificially, but it's the impact of that giving that's the focus of the story. We don't need to know their names. The giving is what's important. So, here's the setup for the story today. Jesus was at the temple one day, hanging out in a part of the temple called the treasury. This is where people brought their offerings to support the temple, kind of like our little offering plate back there on the table. That's where we receive the financial resources that we need to say what Jesus says and do what Jesus do. And on that day, there were many, many rich people putting large sums of money into the offering in the treasury. And there were people gathered there to watch this. And here's where we can use our imagination a little bit. Picture a line of people at the temple, at the treasury. Each one of these people are dressed in fine linens, wearing expensive jewelry. And each one of these people are pouring bags of gold and silver coins, maybe even gemstones, into the coffer. The sound of these coins must have been pretty impressive, because imagine the sound of cascading coins and at the treasury the day that Jesus was there watching. Maybe the spectators were oohing and awing about it. Maybe the spectators were applauding sometimes when all those coins were making all that noise. I don't know. And then something caught Jesus' attention. It wasn't a rich person. It was a poor widow. Maybe it was the way she was dressed. Maybe it was the look on her face. But something about her communicated to Jesus that she wasn't like the other people at the temple that day. She was poor, she was alone, and had very few resources. Now remember, a few weeks back, we were talking about the folks who were at the bottom of the social pyramid during Jesus' day. Widows and orphans were at the very bottom of that social pyramid. But here, this widow was in line at the treasury, at the temple, ready to make an offering to the temple. The rich people's offering sounded like an avalanche. But hers, clink, clink. All she had to offer were 2 copper coins. I imagine there wasn't any applause or oohing and awing. I bet you no one even turned their heads. But this unnamed woman, unknown to the world, caught Jesus' attention. He turned to his disciples and said, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those contributing to the treasury." And I can imagine Judas Iscariot, the Secretary of Finance for the disciples, thinking, wow, Jesus made a serious accounting error here, because those 2 copper coins aren't worth more than the day's offering at the treasury by a long shot. Jesus is lousy at math. The long line of wealthy patrons were giving many times more money than this widow. So how in the world could Jesus say that this widow gave more? Here's where the kingdom of God principle comes in. In God's reign, the widow's offering made a bigger difference than the offerings of the wealthy. Not a bigger difference as far as the finances go. Those 2 copper coins surely didn't supply the oil for the lamps for the day or any sacrificial animals for the temple sacrifice, those 2 copper coins didn't even buy lunch for one of the 60 priests that were at the temple. But it did make a difference in the life and the heart of the giver. When the rich folks poured their money into the temple coffers, honestly, they didn't miss it. They had plenty left over to live however they wanted to. They didn't have to give up any luxuries or sacrifice any ambitions or give up any of their greed, because their offering made very little difference to them except for maybe a pat on the back by the temple leaders. I don't know. Not so for the widow. The moment she heard her coins plink into the coffer, she knew she would feel the effects of that for a long time. She would have to do without whatever luxury she had for the day, if any. She would have to wait until the next time she had money before she fed her own ambitions or maybe even fed her body. She would, as a result of her giving, have to do some serious reprioritizing and rethinking of the day and even her commitment to God. And she would have to do it soon. But somehow she knew that she was doing the right thing because she recognized that her offering was a reflection of her commitment to God. Somehow, the money she left in that box that day was emblematic of the love for God, her gratitude for God's blessings, and her desire to see the work of God continued in her community. She gave painfully, but she gave joyfully. And in return, her little 2-cent gift would impact her forever. Jesus called her gift greater because it made a bigger difference in her life and was a better indication of the sincerity of her commitment than any of the other gifts from any of those wealthy people. Sounds kind of upside down, doesn't it? Yes, it does. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.